September 14, 1944. The morning mist clings to the rolling hills of Luxembourg like a gray shroud, masking the movements below. Through the fog, the silhouettes of American Sherman tanks emerge in perfect formation, dozens of them, their steel hulls gleaming wet in the pale dawn light. The rumble of diesel engines echoes across the valley, a mechanical heartbeat that sends vibrations through the earth. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber adjusts his field glasses with trembling fingers. From his concealed position in the tree line, the young German reconnaissance soldier counts the enemy armor spread across the meadows below. 27, 34. 41 Sherman tanks, their long barrels pointed westward toward the German defensive positions. Behind them, half-tracks and supply trucks form neat rows, while radio antennas bristle like metal wheat from command vehicles. Weber's breath catches in his throat. This is no ordinary American patrol. This is an entire armored division, the dreaded 6th Armored, preparing for what can only be a massive assault. The Americans have brought overwhelming force to bear on this quiet sector, far more than German intelligence had predicted. As he reaches for his radio to alert his battalion commander, Weber doesn't notice the unnatural stillness of the tanks below, or the way their shadows seem too light against the morning grass. The Phantom Army has claimed another observer. The autumn of 1944 found the German army in Western Europe fighting a desperate defensive campaign against overwhelming Allied superiority. Following the successful Normandy landings in June and the subsequent breakout from the Bocage country, American forces had swept across France with stunning speed. By September, General George S. Patton's Third Army had advanced to the borders of Germany itself, its armored spearheads probing the ancient fortress city of Metz and the supposedly impregnable Siegfried Line beyond. Yet Patton's rapid advance had created a dangerous vulnerability. As the Third Army concentrated its forces for the assault on Metz, that heavily fortified bastion guarding the approaches to the German heartland, a massive gap had opened in the American line. 70 miles of front stretched virtually undefended north of Patton's main force, a yawning chasm in the Allied advance that invited German counterattack. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions, though battered and reduced, still possessed enough strength to exploit such weakness if they recognized the opportunity. German intelligence officers studying their maps in underground bunkers could hardly believe their good fortune. Aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts suggested the Americans had overextended themselves in their rush toward Germany. The mysterious quiet along that northern sector seemed to confirm what German commanders desperately wanted to believe, that Patton had gambled everything on a single thrust, leaving his flanks dangerously exposed. If the German armor could break through that gap, they might roll up the entire Third Army advance and perhaps even reach the channel ports that supplied the Allied war machine. But appearances in wartime can deceive, and in September 1944, deception had become an art form practiced by a most unusual group of American soldiers. While Patton's real tanks gathered for their assault on Metz, another kind of armor was quietly taking position in that supposedly empty northern sector. These tanks cast perfect shadows and rumbled with convincing mechanical authority, yet they weighed less than a motorcycle and could be carried by 4 men. They were the tools of America's secret ghost army, and they were about to transform military deception from crude camouflage into high art. The strategic situation demanded immediate action from Allied commanders who understood that time was their most precious resource. Every day German forces remained uncertain about American dispositions was another day for Allied supply lines to strengthen, reinforcements to arrive, and preparations to continue for the final assault into Germany. Traditional military thinking suggested that such gaps in defensive lines should be filled with genuine combat units, but the Allies had developed a more creative solution. Intelligence reports from across the European theater indicated that German reconnaissance capabilities, while still formidable, relied heavily on predictable methods and established procedures. Wehrmacht commanders gathered information through aerial photography, radio intercepts, agent networks, and direct observation, all sources that could potentially be manipulated if the Allies possessed sufficient technical skill and creative imagination. The challenge lay not simply in hiding real military activities, but in creating convincing illusions of activities that existed only in the minds of their creators. The psychological dimension of this challenge proved as complex as the technical requirements. German commanders in the autumn of 1944 were operating under enormous pressure to achieve some meaningful success against the advancing Allies. Months of continuous retreat had created a desperate hunger for good news, making Wehrmacht officers particularly susceptible to intelligence reports that suggested Allied mistakes or vulnerabilities. The most effective deceptions would be those that confirm what German commanders already wanted to believe, that American forces were overextended, overconfident, and vulnerable to concentrated counterattack. The story of America's Phantom Sherman units begins not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the art studios and theater departments of American colleges. In January 1944, as Allied planners prepared for the greatest amphibious assault in human history, they recognized that success would require not just overwhelming force, but masterful misdirection. The lessons of North Africa and Italy had proven that tactical surprise could multiply the effectiveness of military power, while intelligence failures could doom even the best-equipped armies to costly defeats. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops activated at Camp Forest, Tennessee on January 20, 1944, represented a revolutionary approach to military deception. Unlike traditional camouflage units that simply tried to hide real equipment, the 23rd specialized in creating elaborate illusions, entire fake armies complete with tanks, artillery, aircraft, and all the supporting infrastructure of modern mechanized warfare. Their mission was audacious in its simplicity: convince the German army that American forces were larger, stronger, and positioned differently than reality. What made the 23rd unique was not just their mission, but their personnel. Army recruiters had scoured art schools, advertising agencies, and theatrical companies to find men with the creative skills necessary for large-scale deception. Fashion designer Bill Blass found himself crafting camouflage patterns instead of evening gowns. Photographer Art Kane, who would later capture iconic images of jazz musicians in Harlem, used his artistic eye to perfect the placement of dummy equipment. Painter Ellsworth Kelly, future master of minimalist art, applied his understanding of color and form to create convincing military installations from inflatable rubber and canvas. These artists turned soldiers brought an unprecedented attention to detail to the business of military deception. They understood that creating a convincing illusion required more than simply placing fake tanks in a field. Every element had to contribute to the overall performance: the way morning light struck a tank's turret, the patterns that vehicle treads left in mud, the casual arrangement of personal equipment around a command post. They studied real armored divisions like method actors preparing for roles, memorizing everything from radio call signs to the songs different units preferred to sing while marching. The technical foundation of their deceptions rested on innovations born from American industrial ingenuity. Inflatable tanks, manufactured by rubber companies that normally produce balloons and life rafts, could be deployed under cover of darkness and inflated to full size within minutes. From a distance of more than a few hundred yards, these rubber Sherman tanks were virtually indistinguishable from their steel counterparts. Sonic trucks equipped with powerful amplifiers could broadcast recordings of tank movements, artillery fire, or bridge construction across miles of countryside, creating auditory landscapes that perfectly matched the visual deceptions. Radio deception proved equally sophisticated, requiring operators trained not just in military communications procedures, but in the subtle art of mimicry. German intelligence services had learned to identify individual American radio operators by their distinctive fist, the personal rhythm with which each man transmitted Morse code. The 23rd's radio specialists studied these patterns obsessively, learning to imitate not just the technical procedures of different units, but the personal quirks of individual operators. The psychological dimension of their mission was perhaps most complex of all. The Ghost Army had to convince not just German intelligence officers studying reports in distant headquarters, but local civilians who might observe their operations and potentially pass information to enemy agents. This required each member of the 23rd to become an actor, adopting the identity of whatever unit they were impersonating. They wore the correct shoulder patches, displayed the proper vehicle markings, and even learned unit-specific slang and customs. When the Ghost Army impersonated the 6th Armored Division, they didn't simply place inflatable tanks in Luxembourg fields. They studied how 6th Armored soldiers wore their uniforms, what songs they sang, how their military police positioned themselves around division headquarters. They visited local bars and cafes, carefully letting slip fictional details about their unit's strength and intentions. The technical mastery required for successful military deception in 1944 demanded skills that conventional military training had never addressed. Creating convincing phantom armies required understanding not just how real military units operated, but how they appeared to enemy observers using various intelligence-gathering methods. The Ghost Army's engineers and technicians had to master the physics of visual deception, TCs, the acoustics of battlefield sounds, and the electronic characteristics of military communications, all while working under combat conditions with equipment that had never been tested in actual warfare. The visual component of their deceptions represented perhaps the most complex technical challenge. Inflatable tanks had to convince enemy observers not just at long range through binoculars, but also in aerial photographs taken from various altitudes and angles. This required understanding how different materials reflected sunlight, how shadows fell across irregular terrain, and how weather conditions affected visibility. The Ghost Army's artists studied thousands of photographs of real tank formations, analyzing the subtle visual patterns that characterize genuine armored units versus randomly placed equipment. German intelligence methods, thoroughly studied by Allied analysts, revealed specific vulnerabilities that skilled deceivers could exploit. Wehrmacht reconnaissance units operated according to established schedules and procedures, gathering information at predictable times from predictable locations. German aerial photography missions followed standard patterns that could be anticipated and prepared for. Radio intercept stations monitored American communications using standardized techniques that, once understood, could be turned against their operators. The sonic deception program required equally sophisticated technical development. Sound travels differently across various types of terrain, and different weather conditions could dramatically affect how mechanical noises carried across distances. The Ghost Army's sound engineers had to create acoustic profiles of different types of military equipment, recording everything from individual tank engines to the coordinated movements of entire armored formations. These recordings were then edited and mixed to create convincing soundscapes that could be broadcast from concealed speakers positioned miles from enemy observation posts. Radio deception demanded the most subtle technical skills of all. Each American radio operator developed distinctive personal characteristics in their Morse code transmissions, timing patterns, error tendencies, and procedural quirks that German intelligence services cataloged and used to track unit movements. Ghost Army radio specialists had to learn not just the technical procedures of the units they were impersonating, but the personal characteristics of individual operators whose communications they were mimicking. The coordination required between these different technical systems created unprecedented challenges for military planners accustomed to more straightforward combat operations. Visual deceptions had to be synchronized with audio elements so that sounds appeared to originate from locations where enemy observers could see corresponding equipment. Radio transmissions had to match the supposed activities visible in German surveillance reports. Even the timing of routine activities like meals, equipment maintenance, and personnel movements had to conform to authentic military patterns that German intelligence had learned to recognize. Weather conditions affected every aspect of Ghost Army operations in ways that required constant adaptation and creative problem-solving. Fog could conceal visual deceptions, but also muffle sound transmission. Rain could damage inflatable equipment, but also provide cover for deployment and repositioning. Wind could carry sounds in unexpected directions while also affecting how camouflage materials appeared to aerial observers. The Ghost Army's success depended on their ability to adapt their technical systems to constantly changing environmental conditions while maintaining the overall consistency of their deceptive narrative. The human element of these operations proved just as technically demanding as the equipment components. Soldiers performing the roles of authentic military personnel had to understand not just what activities to perform, but how to perform them in ways that would appear natural to distant observers. This required training in everything from military courtesy and uniform regulations to the specific customs and procedures of different types of units. A soldier impersonating a tank crew member had to move and behave differently than one playing the role of artillery personnel or support troops. German intelligence capabilities, while sophisticated in many respects, showed specific weaknesses that the Ghost Army learned to exploit systematically. Wehrmacht analysis procedures relied heavily on correlating information from multiple sources, but they assumed that consistent reports from different intelligence methods indicated reliable information. If visual observations, radio intercepts, and agent reports all confirmed the same details about American unit dispositions, German analysts rarely questioned whether those multiple sources might all be reflecting the same carefully constructed deception. The human dimension of Ghost Army operations revealed the profound psychological complexities of warfare conducted through systematic deception. Unlike conventional soldiers whose enemies were clearly defined and whose objectives were straightforward, members of the 23rd Special Troops found themselves operating in a morally ambiguous realm, where success was measured not by defeating opponents in direct confrontation, but by convincing them to make fatal mistakes based on false information. The artists and designers recruited into the Ghost Army brought unique perspectives to military problems that conventional soldiers might never have considered. Fashion designer Bill Blass understood how fabric textures and color combinations could create specific visual impressions at various distances. Photographer Art Kane knew how lighting conditions affected the apparent size and position of objects in images. Painter Ellsworth Kelly could analyze how geometric shapes and color relationships influenced human perception. These artistic skills, developed for civilian creative work, proved remarkably applicable to military deception operations. The psychological profile of ideal Ghost Army personnel differed dramatically from traditional combat soldiers. Successful deception operations required individuals capable of sustained role-playing, attention to minute details, and the ability to think creatively under pressure. These men had to be comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, since the success of their missions often couldn't be measured until weeks or months later when intelligence reports revealed how effectively they had influenced enemy decision-making processes. German commanders facing these deceptions experienced their own complex psychological challenges. Wehrmacht officers in the autumn of 1944 were operating under enormous pressure to achieve meaningful tactical successes against numerically superior Allied forces. This pressure created a predisposition to interpret intelligence reports optimistically, seeing opportunities where more objective analysis might have revealed problems or inconsistencies. The Ghost Army's deceptions succeeded partly because they told German commanders what they wanted to hear, that American forces were making the kinds of mistakes that aggressive German tactics might exploit. The relationship between Ghost Army personnel and the genuine combat units whose safety depended on their deceptive operations created unique emotional stresses. Unlike support troops whose contributions to military success were clearly defined and measurable, Ghost Army soldiers operated in a realm where their effectiveness could only be judged by events that didn't happen, German attacks that were never launched, defensive positions that were never properly prepared, opportunities that were never recognized or exploited. Local civilian populations caught between the opposing forces experienced the Ghost Army's operations in ways that military planners had never fully anticipated. French and Belgian civilians who observed American military activities often became inadvertent participants in deception operations, carrying information about what they had seen to German agents or sympathizers. The Ghost Army learned to use these civilian observations as part of their deceptive strategy, ensuring that local populations saw exactly what German intelligence services needed them to report. The moral complexity of these operations extended beyond simple questions of military effectiveness to encompass broader issues about the nature of warfare itself. Traditional military ethics assumed that combat involved direct confrontation between clearly identified opponents using conventional weapons and tactics. The Ghost Army's methods blurred these distinctions, using psychological manipulation and systematic deception to achieve strategic objectives without direct violence. The selection and training of Ghost Army personnel required developing entirely new military specialties that had no precedent in conventional army organization. These soldiers needed skills that combined traditional military knowledge with artistic creativity, theatrical performance ability, and psychologicus insight. Training programs had to teach recruits not just how to operate inflatable equipment or broadcast sound effects, but how to think like the enemy intelligence officers they were trying to deceive. Intelligence gathering about German capabilities and procedures became a critical component of Ghost Army's success. These operations required detailed knowledge of how Wehrmacht reconnaissance units operated, what information German intelligence services considered most valuable, and how enemy commanders made tactical decisions based on available intelligence. This intelligence had to be current and accurate, since German procedures and capabilities evolved throughout the war in response to Allied activities. The effectiveness of Ghost Army operations depended ultimately on understanding the psychological and organizational characteristics of German military culture. Wehrmacht commanders made decisions according to established procedures and doctrine that could be studied and predicted. German intelligence services analyzed information using standardized methods that revealed specific biases and blind spots. Even individual German officers displayed personal characteristics and decision-making patterns that skilled analysts could identify and exploit. The Ghost Army's success reflected not just technical innovation or creative thinking, but a sophisticated understanding of their opponents as human beings operating within specific cultural and organizational constraints. The morning of September 15, 1944, brought new urgency to the headquarters of Army Group G, where German commanders studied reconnaissance reports with growing excitement. Throughout the night, radio intercepts had confirmed the presence of substantial American forces in the northern sector of Patton's front, precisely where German intelligence had detected that dangerous gap in Allied lines. The reports painted a picture that seemed almost too good to be true. An entire American armored division, the 6th Armored, had apparently moved into defensive positions with insufficient infantry support. Oberst Heinrich Müller, intelligence officer for the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, spread aerial photographs across his map table with trembling hands. The images, captured by one of the Luftwaffe's few remaining reconnaissance aircraft, showed clear evidence of American armor deployed across several square miles of Luxembourg countryside. Tank formations, supply depots, command posts, all the elements of a major armored unit positioned exactly where German forces might break through and roll up the American flank. What Muller couldn't see in those photographs was the careful artistry that had created the scene below. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 14th, soldiers of the 23rd Special Troops had moved through the Luxembourg fields like stagehands preparing for an elaborate theatrical production. Inflatable Sherman tanks, deflated and folded into compact bundles, had been carried into position by teams of 4 men each. Portable air compressors, their engines muffled by special sound-dampening equipment, had transformed these rubber shells into convincing replicas of America's most famous tank. The technical precision required for such deceptions went far beyond simply inflating rubber tanks and hoping for the best. Each installation had to be positioned to account for natural lighting conditions, seasonal weather patterns, and the viewing angles from which German observers were most likely to study them. The Ghost Army's artists understood that morning sunlight striking a tank from the east would create different shadow patterns than afternoon light from the west, and they positioned their inflatable equipment accordingly. Around each dummy tank, teams of soldiers created the subtle environmental details that would sell the deception to careful observers. Tank tracks were pressed into muddy ground using specially designed rollers. Personal equipment, helmets, ammunition boxes, maintenance tools, was arranged with the casual disorder that characterized real armored units. Camouflage netting was draped over some vehicles while others remained exposed, mimicking the mixed concealment practices of genuine tank battalions. The sonic component of the operation required equally meticulous preparation. Sound trucks positioned at carefully calculated distances from German observation posts broadcast recordings of tank engines, radio chatter, and maintenance activities. These audio tracks, recorded from real armored divisions during training exercises, had been edited and mixed by sound engineers borrowed from Hollywood studios. The resulting soundtrack of military activity was so convincing that even members of the 23rd found themselves looking for tanks that existed only in their speakers. But perhaps the most sophisticated element of the deception involved the human performers who brought the Phantom Division to life. Soldiers wearing 6th Armored Division patches moved between the dummy installations, creating the visual impression of normal military activity. They conducted mock inspections of inflatable tanks, held briefings beside rubber command vehicles, and maintained radio communications using the authentic call signs and procedures of the unit they were impersonating. This human element extended beyond the immediate tactical deception to encompass a broader campaign of strategic misdirection. 23rd personnel visited local establishments in nearby towns, carefully cultivating relationships with civilians who might observe their activities or overhear their conversations. They spoke in measured tones about their unit's strength, its recent movements, and its apparent mission, always ensuring that any information they revealed would reinforce the impression of a genuine armored division preparing for defensive operations. The psychological impact on German decision-makers proved even more significant than the tactical deception itself. Wehrmacht commanders, operating under enormous pressure to achieve some meaningful success against the advancing Allies, were predisposed to interpret intelligence reports in the most favorable possible light. When multiple sources, aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, agent reports, and prisoner interrogations, all confirmed the presence of isolated American armor in a vulnerable position, German commanders allowed hope to override skepticism. General Major Franz Sensfuss, commanding the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, reviewed the intelligence summaries with growing confidence. His own division, though reduced to perhaps 60% of its authorized strength, still possessed enough tanks and assault guns to overwhelm an isolated American armored unit, particularly if caught in unprepared positions. What Sensfuss couldn't have known was that every piece of intelligence reaching his headquarters had been carefully crafted by the Ghost Army to support their deceptive narrative. Radio transmissions that German intercept stations dutifully recorded and analyzed were actually being broadcast by 23rd operators who had studied the communication patterns of real armored divisions. Agent reports from local civilians reflected conversations with American soldiers who were consciously playing theatrical roles. Even the aerial photographs that seemed to provide objective confirmation showed exactly what the Ghost Army had intended German reconnaissance to see. The technical sophistication of these deceptions reflected months of experimentation and refinement. At training facilities in England and later in Normandy, the 23rd had tested every aspect of their equipment and procedures under conditions that simulated actual combat operations. They had learned that inflatable tanks viewed from certain angles cast shadows that didn't match those of real armor, so they developed techniques for positioning dummy equipment to minimize such discrepancies. They discovered that certain rubber compounds used in their decoy vehicles reflected sunlight differently than steel, leading to the development of special paints that more accurately mimicked the visual characteristics of genuine military equipment. The sonic deception program had undergone similarly rigorous development. Engineers had studied how different types of ground, rocky, sandy, muddy, affected the transmission of mechanical sounds across various distances. They had analyzed the acoustic signatures of different types of military vehicles, creating detailed profiles that allowed them to broadcast convincing audio representations of specific equipment types. Most importantly, they had learned to coordinate their audio deceptions with visual elements, ensuring that sounds appeared to originate from locations where observers could see corresponding equipment. As the third week of September 1944 unfolded, German commanders found themselves facing a strategic dilemma that would ultimately vindicate every hour the Ghost Army had spent perfecting their craft. Intelligence reports continued to confirm the presence of substantial American forces in what appeared to be vulnerable positions, yet German commanders hesitated to commit their limited reserves to what might prove to be a costly gamble. The very believability of the Ghost Army's deceptions had created a psychological trap. The opportunity seemed so promising that experienced Wehrmacht officers began to suspect it might be deliberate Allied bait. The crescendo of the Ghost Army's most ambitious performance began at 0400 hours on September 18, 1944, when German artillery observers reported unusual activity in the American sector. Through their powerful telescopes, Wehrmacht forward observers could see increased movement around what they believed to be 6th Armored Division positions, tanks repositioning, supply vehicles moving between installations, and groups of soldiers conducting what appeared to be final preparations for either an attack or a withdrawal. What the German observers were actually witnessing was the Ghost Army's most sophisticated piece of heater yet attempted. Under cover of pre-dawn darkness, teams of 23rd personnel had begun a carefully choreographed sequence of movements designed to suggest that the American Armored Division was preparing for immediate action. Inflatable tanks were repositioned to new locations, creating the impression of tactical redeployment. Sonic trucks broadcast recordings of increased radio traffic, engine maintenance, and ammunition loading, all the acoustic signatures that would accompany a real armored unit preparing for combat operations. Hauptmann Josef Kessler, commanding a forward observation post of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, watched the American positions through high-powered binoculars as dawn broke over the Luxembourg hills. The scene before him confirmed his worst fears about German defensive preparations. The Americans had positioned what appeared to be a full armored battalion in a location that would allow them to strike deep into German rear areas if they broke through the thinly held defensive line. Kessler's immediate concern was the placement of German anti-tank guns, which had been positioned to defend against attacks along more predictable avenues of approach. If the Americans attacked from their current positions, German defensive fire would be largely ineffective until the assault force had penetrated deep enough to encounter prepared positions. The tactical situation demanded immediate redeployment of anti-tank weapons to meet this unexpected threat. Within hours of Kessler's report reaching division headquarters, German commanders began shifting their most powerful weapons to counter the apparent American threat. 88mm anti-tank guns, the Wehrmacht's most effective armor-killing weapons, were moved from positions covering likely attack routes to new installations that could engage the 6th Armored Division's apparent Assam-Bly area. Self-propelled assault guns were repositioned to provide additional firepower against the expected American advance. This redeployment of German defensive assets represented exactly the kind of strategic success that justified every aspect of the Ghost Army's elaborate deception. By convincing Wehrmacht commanders to commit their limited anti-tank weapons to defending against a phantom threat, the 23rd Special Troops had effectively reduced German defensive capabilities along the routes where Patton's real armor would eventually advance. The morning of September 21, 1944, brought an atmosphere of tense anticipation to German command posts throughout the sector, as Wehrmacht commanders prepared to test their theories about American vulnerability against the harsh realities of modern armored warfare. General Major Sensfuss had finally received authorization from Army Group G to probe the apparent 6th Armored Division positions with a reinforced reconnaissance in force, a tactical mission that would determine whether the Americans were indeed as isolated and vulnerable as intelligence reports suggested. Unknown to German planners, their target had begun to dissolve even as they finalized their attack preparations. Throughout the previous night, Ghost Army personnel had worked with the same methodical precision that had characterized their initial deployment, but now in reverse. Inflatable tanks were deflated and folded into compact bundles, sonic equipment was loaded onto trucks, and radio operators began transmitting the final communications that would suggest the 6th Armored Division was withdrawing from its exposed positions to consolidate with other American forces. The withdrawal phase of a Ghost Army operation required just as much technical skill and artistic sensitivity as the initial deployment. Simply removing the dummy equipment would have created obvious evidence of deception that German intelligence might eventually piece together. Instead, the 23rd had developed sophisticated, aided procedures for suggesting that genuine military units were conducting normal tactical movements, repositioning to avoid enemy contact, consolidating scattered elements, or responding to orders from higher headquarters. Sonic trucks broadcast recordings of vehicle engines starting up, track movement across various terrain types, and the general mechanical cacophony that accompanied large-scale military movements. These audio tracks had been carefully timed to coincide with the visual evidence of withdrawal that German observers would see as inflatable equipment disappeared from their previous positions. Radio operators transmitted messages using authentic military procedures, reporting unit movements and coordination requirements in ways that reinforced the impression of a genuine tactical withdrawal. Hauptmann Kessler, observing the American withdrawal through his powerful binoculars, felt a mixture of disappointment and relief that would be shared by German commanders throughout the sector. The tactical opportunity that had seemed so promising was apparently evaporating as American forces recognized their vulnerability and took steps to correct it. While this eliminated the immediate prospect of a significant German victory, it also reduced the risk of a costly failure if the attack had encountered stronger resistance than anticipated. By midday on September 21st, the last elements of the Phantom's 6th Armored Division had vanished from the Luxembourg countryside, leaving behind only the environmental traces that would suggest genuine military occupation: tire tracks in muddy fields, trash pits, communication wire, and the thousand small artifacts that accumulate wherever large numbers of soldiers live and work. These residual traces had been carefully created and positioned to reinforce the impression that a real armored division had indeed occupied the sector for EMG. Several days before withdrawing in response to tactical developments, German commanders, studying intelligence reports from the now quiet sector, found themselves confronting questions that would never be fully answered. Had the American Armored Division withdrawn in response to German reconnaissance activities, suggesting that Wehrmacht intelligence gathering had been detected and effective? Or had the Americans recognized their tactical vulnerability independently, demonstrating the kind of professional competence that made them such formidable opponents? The strategic implications of these questions extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. If German intelligence capabilities were sufficient to force American tactical adjustments, Wehrmacht commanders might reasonably expect similar successes in future operations. If American commanders were sufficiently skilled to recognize and correct their own tactical errors, German forces faced opponents who would be increasingly difficult to surprise or outmaneuver. In fact, neither interpretation captured the true nature of what had occurred. The Ghost Army had successfully convinced German commanders to spend a critical week focusing on phantom threats, while real American forces continued their preparations for genuine offensive operations. The time and resources Wehrmacht commanders had invested in planning operations against inflatable tanks represented a strategic loss that could never be recovered, regardless of how skillfully German forces might perform in future engagements. The human cost of this deception would only become apparent in the weeks that followed, as Patton's real armor launched its assault on Metz with German anti-tank guns positioned to defend against attacks that would never come. The 88mm weapons that had been repositioned to engage the Phantom's 6th Armored Division were not available to oppose genuine American tanks when they finally advanced along different routes toward their actual objectives. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Reeder, commanding officer of the 23rd Special Troops, reviewed after-action reports from the Luxembourg operation with the satisfaction of a theater director whose production had achieved exactly its intended effect. Every technical system had functioned properly, every human performance had maintained its authenticity, and every piece of intelligence German commanders had received had supported the narrative his unit had constructed. Yet Reeder also understood the moral complexity of warfare conducted through such elaborate deceptions. The success of his unit's operations would ultimately be measured not in territory captured or enemy forces destroyed, but in American lives saved through the misdirection of German military efforts. This indirect relationship between Ghost Army activities and battlefield outcomes made it difficult to quantify their contributions to Allied victory, even as those contributions grew increasingly significant with each successful operation. The psychological impact on German decision-making processes proved particularly difficult to measure, but potentially more important than any direct tactical advantages. Wehrmacht commanders who had experienced the frustration of planning operations against targets that proved to be phantoms would inevitably approach future intelligence reports with increased skepticism. This erosion of confidence in their own intelligence capabilities would make German commanders less likely to exploit genuine Allied vulnerabilities when they eventually appeared. The immediate aftermath of the Luxembourg deception revealed the full scope of what the Ghost Army had accomplished during their week-long performance. German intelligence officers, analyzing reports from the now quiet sector, struggled to reconcile conflicting pieces of information about American force dispositions and intentions. Radio intercepts that had provided detailed insights into 6th Armored Division activities suddenly went silent, leaving Wehrmacht signals intelligence units with no clear explanation for the communication blackout. Aerial reconnaissance missions over the areas where German observers had documented substantial American armor found empty fields marked only by tire tracks and debris patterns that suggested recent military occupation. These physical traces provide the compelling evidence that significant numbers of vehicles had indeed been present in the sector, yet no logical explanation existed for how an entire armored division could have withdrawn so completely and quickly without being detected by German surveillance efforts. The confusion extended beyond simple intelligence analysis to encompass broader questions about Allied operational capabilities and intentions. Had the Americans demonstrated previously unknown logistical capabilities by moving large armored formations without detection? Had German reconnaissance and surveillance systems proven inadequate to monitor enemy activities in sectors they believed to be under effective observation? Or had Wehrmacht commanders fundamentally misunderstood Allied tactical doctrine and decision-making processes? These questions would never be definitively answered, creating a persistent uncertainty that would influence German planning for subsequent operations. Intelligence officers who had confidently reported American dispositions and activities now found themselves questioning the reliability of their own sources and methods. Commanders who had based tactical decisions on seemingly solid intelligence began to doubt their ability to accurately assess Allied capabilities and intentions. The strategic value of this induced uncertainty far exceeded any immediate tactical advantages the Ghost Army might have achieved through direct confrontation. German forces operating under conditions of information uncertainty were more likely to make conservative decisions, commit resources to defending against unlikely threats, and hesitate to exploit genuine opportunities when they appeared. The psychological advantage of forcing opponents to question their own judgment proved more valuable than destroying equivalent numbers of enemy tanks or soldiers through conventional combat. Meanwhile, the human performers who had brought the Phantom 6th Armored Division to life experienced their own complex reactions to the success of their elaborate deception. Soldiers who had spent days playing theatrical roles found themselves grappling with questions about the nature of military service and their contributions to the war effort. Unlike infantry or armor soldiers whose actions produced clear, measurable results, Ghost Army personnel operated in a realm where success was defined by convincing enemies to make mistakes rather than by directly defeating them in combat. The broader implications of the Ghost Army's success became apparent as Allied intelligence services began to document the long-term effects of deception operations on German military decision-making throughout the autumn and winter of 1944. Wehrmacht commanders, having experienced the frustration of planning attacks against phantom American forces, approached subsequent intelligence reports with increased caution and skepticism that significantly slowed their response times to genuine Allied activities. This erosion of German confidence in their own intelligence capabilities proved particularly valuable during the preparation phases of major Allied operations, when American forces began their actual offensive. For preparations around Metz in November 1944, German commanders hesitated to commit reserves against what might prove to be another elaborate deception. The psychological legacy of encountering phantom Sherman tanks in Luxembourg created a persistent uncertainty that influenced German tactical decisions for months after the Ghost Army had moved on to other missions. The technical innovations pioneered by the 23rd Special Troops would influence military deception programs long after World War II ended, establishing principles and procedures that remain relevant to modern information warfare and strategic deception operations. Their integration of visual, audio, and radio deception techniques with human performance elements created a template for comprehensive deception programs that addressed all aspects of enemy intelligence gathering capabilities. Perhaps most significantly, the Ghost Army demonstrated that warfare in the modern era required not just traditional military skills, but creative thinking and artistic sensibilities that could imagine new ways to achieve strategic objectives. The fashion designers, artists, and actors who had been recruited into the 23rd Special Troops brought perspectives to military problems that conventional soldiers might never have considered, proving that victory in complex conflicts might depend as much on imagination and creativity as on firepower and tactical skill. The Phantom Sherman units that had briefly terrorized German commanders in Luxembourg represented more than just successful military deception. They embodied a fundamental transformation in the nature of warfare itself. In future conflicts, the ability to manipulate enemy perceptions and decision-making processes would become as important as the capacity to destroy enemy forces through direct confrontation, leaving behind a legacy written not in captured territory, but in the minds of those who learned to question the very nature of reality in war.